Ethan had always been a practical person, someone who liked to plan for the future. He loved his home, a modest but comfortable house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The house had a small garden, neat flower beds, and a driveway that was wide, enough for 2 cars. Ethan took pride in keeping everything clean and organized. But there was one thing that made him especially proud: his solar panels. He had spent months researching, calling different companies, reading reviews, and comparing prices. Finally, he had chosen the best system that not only powered his home, but also contributed energy to the neighborhood's shared security system. Most of the houses in the community had agreed to this plan because it saved money and kept everyone safer. The idea of his solar panels feeding into a system that protected his neighbors made Ethan feel like he was part of something bigger. It wasn't just about electricity. It was about responsibility, safety, and community. For a while, everything went perfectly. The panels worked silently on his roof, soaking up the sun during the day and powering his home efficiently at night. The extra energy helped keep the security cameras running, and everyone in the neighborhood felt a little safer knowing that Ethan's panels were quietly helping watch over their streets. Neighbors often came by to compliment him on the panels, saying how modern and smart they looked. Ethan smiled every time he heard it. It felt good to be appreciated, but more than that, he was happy knowing he was making a difference. However, there was one person in the neighborhood who never seemed satisfied. Her name was Karen, and she had built a reputation for being difficult long before Ethan moved in. Karen was a member of the HOA, and she had a sharp eye for anything she didn't like. It didn't matter whether it was a garden decoration, a new mailbox, or a simple paint color. Karen had an opinion, and she made sure everyone knew it. People whispered about her behind closed doors, calling her a HOA Karen because she would complain about things others barely noticed. From the moment Ethan installed his solar panels, Karen seemed to take notice. At first it was small. "Comments, those panels don't look right," she said to him one morning while walking her dog. Ethan nodded politely, trying not to make a big deal out of it. "They're functional," he said. "They help everyone in the neighborhood." Karen raised her eyebrows, clearly unimpressed. Over the next few weeks, her comments became sharper. She started attending HOA meetings and bringing up the panels, claiming that they were ugly and lowering property values. Ethan was careful not to argue. He knew that arguing with Karen was usually pointless. She thrived on conflict. Still, it was frustrating. How could someone be so focused on appearances that they ignored something that actually helped everyone? Ethan tried to ignore her, hoping the situation would blow over. He continued to maintain the panels, making sure they were clean and in perfect working order. He even spoke to some of the neighbors to reassure them that the system was safe and reliable. Many of them were grateful, though a few had no idea how much the panels contributed. They didn't fully understand that the cameras and alarms were running on energy from Ethan's roof. They only saw the panels as an unusual feature. On his house, despite Ethan's efforts to keep things calm, Karen's behavior escalated. She started sending emails to the HOA, complaining about the panels in increasingly dramatic terms. She called them an eyesore and insisted that something must be done immediately. The HOA board tried to mediate, reminding her that the panels were approved months ago and that many residents supported them. Karen didn't care. She insisted that the panels violated some vague rule she had in mind, even though no written rule existed. Ethan began to feel the tension more acutely every day. He noticed Karen watching him whenever he went outside, almost as if she were waiting for a reason to attack him. He could see her pointing out details to anyone who would listen, creating a narrative that the panels were a problem. Even though they had never caused any issues, Ethan tried to focus on the positive he had spent. A lot of money on the system, and it worked perfectly. But the constant scrutiny from Karen started to wear on him. He found himself double-checking the panels every day, making sure everything was spotless and functioning. One sunny afternoon, as Ethan was cleaning the panels with a soft cloth, he thought about how strange it was that one person could have such a negative influence over an entire community. Most neighbors were friendly, appreciative, and respectful, but Karen seemed determined to find fault in everything. Her influence on the HOA meant that she had power, and that power often made people nervous. Ethan wondered how far she would go. Would she continue complaining? Or would she actually try to interfere with the panels themselves? The thought made him uneasy. He decided to take precautions. Ethan installed additional locks on the gates and even set up temporary cameras aimed at his roof. He didn't want to overreact, but something inside told him that Karen's obsession was not going to stop at words alone. Ethan hoped he was wrong, but he also knew he had to be prepared. The panels were more than just metal and wires. They represented safety, security, and months of hard work. He couldn't afford to let anyone compromise that. Meanwhile, Karen's behavior in the neighborhood became more noticeable. Other residents whispered about her constant surveillance and her complaints about every minor detail. Some tried to stay out of her way, afraid of becoming her next target. Ethan noticed that. Even the HOA board seemed to tread carefully around her, reluctant to push back too hard. It frustrated him to see her power unchecked, but he resolved to stay focused on what mattered most. Keeping the panels intact and ensuring the security system remained functional. As days passed, Ethan grew more vigilant. He made sure the panels were clean, the connections were secure, and the system was running smoothly. He checked the energy readings daily and even tested the security cameras himself. Everything was working perfectly, but the tension in the neighborhood was growing. Ethan could sense it in the way people talked behind closed doors, in the way Karen looked at him with a mix of annoyance and determination. It was like a storm gathering on the horizon, quiet now, but threatening to explode at any moment. Then, one evening, as Ethan sat on his porch sipping tea, he noticed Karen walking past his house. She glanced up at the roof, her expression hard to read. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. He knew that whatever happened next could change everything. The solar panels were not just a personal project anymore. They were a source of safety for the entire community. And he had a feeling that Karen had no idea just how important they were. Despite the growing tension, Ethan remained calm. He reminded himself that he had done everything correctly, followed all rules, and contributed to the neighborhood's safety. He couldn't control Karen's actions, but he could control his own. He decided to prepare, to stay alert, and to protect what he had built. The peace and security of the neighborhood were at stake, and Ethan knew that he had to be ready for whatever Karen might try next. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the quiet street, Ethan felt a mixture of pride and anxiety. He had created something valuable, something that benefited not just him, but everyone around him. But he also realized that not everyone appreciated the effort or understood its importance. He knew that Karen's obsession with appearances could turn into something much more serious. Little did he know, the next few days would bring a shock that no one could have predicted. Karen's obsession would escalate in ways that would endanger the entire neighborhood. And Ethan would have to face a challenge unlike anything he had ever imagined. The calm, quiet days were over, replaced by a tension that hung in the air, like a storm cloud, ready to burst. Ethan didn't sleep much that night. He walked around the house several times, checking the locks and peering up at the panels. Everything seemed normal, but his instincts told him that normal was about to be shattered. He thought about the neighbors who relied on the security system, the cameras that kept watch, and the peace of mind that came from knowing someone was looking out for them. It wasn't just about electricity anymore. It was about safety, trust, and responsibility. And so Ethan waited, fully aware that his life, his home, and the neighborhood's security could all be challenged by one determined HOA member. But did he know the events that were about to unfold would test his patience, his resolve, and his ability to protect something far greater than himself? The morning after Ethan had stayed up late checking the panels, the neighborhood seemed unusually quiet. Birds chirped lazily, and a soft breeze stirred the leaves on the trees, but there was a strange tension in the air. Ethan stepped outside to get the mail, expecting a normal, peaceful day. What he saw instead made his stomach twist. The solar panels on his roof, the very panels he had spent months installing and maintaining, were no longer the sleek, shining units that gleamed in the sunlight. Thick, uneven layers of gray paint covered them. It looked as if someone had walked up to the roof in the dead of night and deliberately ruined them. Ethan froze, staring in disbelief. He could hardly breathe for a moment. His mind raced, trying to process what he was seeing. He had feared Karen's obsession might lead to trouble, but he never imagined she would actually vandalize the panels. Immediately, Mitha ran around the house looking for signs of forced entry. The back gate was locked, the doors were secure, and nothing else appeared disturbed. But the roof, his pride, the source of the neighborhood's security system, was completely ruined. He knew instantly who was responsible. There was only one person in the neighborhood who had shown that kind of obsession with the panels, someone who had been complaining about them every day, Karen. Ethan's hands trembled as he pulled out his phone. He needed to see if any neighbors had noticed anything. He called his friend Maria, who lived 2 houses down. Maria answered groggily. "Hey, Ethan, what's up?" she said. "Maria, you need to look at my roof," Ethan said, his voice tight with anger. "Something happened overnight. The panels, they've been painted over." There was a pause. "On the other end?" Then Maria gasped. "Are you serious? I didn't see anything this morning. I'll come over." By the time Maria arrived, other neighbors were starting to come outside, drawn by the commotion. People whispered, pointing at the roof. What happened? Did a painter come by? Why would someone do that? Ethan could feel his frustration growing. He explained calmly, though his voice was strained, that the panels had been vandalized. Most neighbors were shocked, but a few looked confused. Not fully understanding the significance of the panels beyond electricity, Ethan's frustration turned into panic as he realized the real danger. The solar panels didn't just power his home, they fed energy into the neighborhood's security system. Without them, the cameras and alarms were offline. He had warned people before, but no one had fully grasped what he meant. Now the consequences were unavoidable. He ran inside and grabbed his laptop, checking the system remotely. The security network was down. The cameras were offline, the alarms unresponsive. He felt a wave of panic wash over him. This is bad, he muttered to himself. Really bad. Ethan immediately called the HOA. He demanded to speak to someone in charge. The HOA secretary answered, and Ethan explained the situation. She tried to remain calm, but her voice betrayed concern. "We'll send someone over," she said. "Maybe it's just an accident. We'll figure it out." Ethan didn't wait. He needed evidence. He had recently installed a small camera at the side of the house, a precaution he had taken because of Karen's behavior. He checked the footage. What he saw made his blood run cold. There was Karen, moving carefully and deliberately across the roof in the middle of the night, a paint roller in her hand. She paused several times as if admiring her own work, then continued spreading thick gray paint over each solar panel. She had clearly planned this. She had broken no doors or windows because she had climbed over the fence quietly. Ethan felt a mix of anger and disbelief. He had tried to ignore her antics, hoping the situation would resolve itself peacefully. But now it was clear. Karen's obsession had turned dangerous. She didn't just want the panels gone. She wanted to sabotage them completely. As he reviewed the footage, Maria came over and looked at the screen. Her eyes widened. "Oh my God, that's Karen," she whispered. "I can't believe she would do this." Ethan nodded grimly. Not just being annoying anymore, just putting everyone at risk. He could feel the weight of responsibility pressing on him. The cameras that protected their homes, the alarms that could warn of break-ins, all of that was offline now. Because of Karen, neighbors began discussing what had happened. Some were outraged, others confused, and a few tried to defend Karen, saying she had probably misunderstood the rules. Ethan shook his head. "This wasn't a mistake," he said. "This was deliberate." The HOA quickly called a meeting to address the situation. Karen, predictably, denied everything at first, claiming she had seen someone else on the roof. But when Ethan presented the security footage, her protests faltered. The evidence was undeniable. She had been caught red-handed, vandalizing the panels in the dead of night. While the HOA deliberated, the reality of the situation began to sink in for the rest of the neighborhood. That evening, some residents noticed that their security cameras were offline. Panic spread as they realized that the system that had kept them safe for months was suddenly useless. Children played outside less, doors were double-locked, and neighbors kept checking their phones for any alerts from the system. Ethan spent the entire night trying to restore what he could. He called the solar company, the security system company. Anyone who could help, but the damage was extensive. Paint had penetrated the panels, and it would take weeks to repair. Meanwhile, the neighborhood was vulnerable. Ethan felt helpless in a way he had never felt before. As the days passed, the consequences of Karen's actions became more apparent. Reports of petty thefts in the area increased because the cameras weren't recording. Even small incidents like a package being stolen from a porch caused outrage. Residents began to connect the dots, realizing that Ethan's solar panels had been doing more than just powering their homes. They had been protecting the entire community. The irony was not lost on Ethan. Karen, who had complained so bitterly about appearances and property values, had now endangered the very people she claimed to care about. Every step she took to fix the neighborhood had made it less safe, and yet she walked around as if nothing had happened, insisting she had done nothing wrong. Ethan knew he had to act fast. He began documenting everything meticulously. Photos of the panels, the security footage, emails to the HOA, witness statements from neighbors. He wasn't going to let Karen get away with this. He also began talking to neighbors individually, explaining the severity of the situation. Many of them were shocked to learn how much the panels contributed to their safety. Some expressed regret for not paying closer attention earlier, realizing that Ethan had been trying to protect them all along. Despite the growing tension, Ethan remained calm and focused. He knew that anger alone wouldn't solve the problem. He had to strategize to make sure that Karen was held accountable and that the panels were restored. He also needed to repair the trust and safety of the neighborhood, which had been shaken by the sudden failure of the security system. Meanwhile, Karen's behavior became more erratic. She continued attending HOA meetings, speaking loudly about community rules and aesthetic standards, as if her actions had been justified. Some neighbors were intimidated by her, but others began to see her true nature. It became clear that Karen's obsession with control and appearances was dangerous, not just irritating. Ethan's persistence began to pay off. The HOA, faced with undeniable evidence, finally acknowledged that Karen had acted outside her authority and had caused serious damage. They agreed to hold her responsible and work with Ethan to restore the panels. Ethan felt a small sense of relief, but he knew the repairs would take time. The neighborhood's security would remain compromised until then. As the sun set on the first week after the vandalism, Ethan stood on his porch again, looking at the gray panels that had been his pride and joy. He felt a mixture of frustration, sadness, and determination. Karen had tried to destroy what he had built, but he was not going to let her succeed. He would repair the panels, restore the security system, make sure the neighborhood understood their value. The situation had changed everything. What had started as a quiet, peaceful community with a helpful solar system had become a battleground between one obsessed HOA member and a man determined to protect his home and neighbors. Ethan knew that the coming days would be challenging, but he also felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just protecting solar panels, he was defending safety, trust, and the peace of his community. And as he looked up at the gray roof, Ethan realized one thing clearly. Karen had made a mistake. She would regret. She had underestimated him, underestimated the importance of the panels, and underestimated how far he would go to protect what was right. The quiet neighborhood would never be the same. And the storm that had begun with a simple complaint about aesthetics was only just getting started. The morning after the panels were vandalized, the neighborhood felt different. There was a quiet tension in the air, like everyone was holding their breath. The first time, people were noticing that the security cameras weren't working. Doors were double-locked, gates were checked repeatedly, and neighbors were peeking out of windows more than usual. Ethan felt the pressure more than anyone. He knew what the painted-over panels meant, not just for his home, but for everyone around him, as he walked to the corner of the street. He noticed that some neighbors were talking in small groups. Their faces showed worry, confusion, and in some cases frustration. Many of them had never realized how important Ethan's panels were. They thought of them as just an extra electricity source, something eco-friendly, but not essential. Now it became clear that they had been wrong. Ethan approached Mr. Johnson, an older man who lived across the street. "Did you notice the cameras are down?" Ethan asked. Mr. Johnson shook his head, looking concerned. "I saw that the street light by my house didn't come on last night. I thought it was just a glitch." Ethan's heart sank. The system was more integrated than he had thought. The panels not only powered the neighborhood cameras, they were linked to the streetlights, alarms, and even the motion sensors that alerted the HOA of unusual activity. Without them, the entire community was vulnerable. By late morning, the first incident occurred. A young man on a bicycle stopped at the corner and knocked over a mailbox. He grabbed a package, looked around nervously, and rode off. Normally, the cameras would have recorded his face, and the alarms would have alerted the neighbors. But today, no cameras, no alerts. Nothing. When Mrs. Patel, the neighbor whose package was stolen, realized what had happened, she screamed for help. People rushed out of their homes, including Ethan, but the thief was already gone. Some neighbors were shaking their heads, muttering about how unprotected they felt. Ethan felt a tight knot of guilt and anger. This wouldn't have happened. If the panels were working, he said under his breath, clenching his fists. Word spread quickly. By noon, multiple incidents had occurred, doors left slightly ajar, bikes moved from yards, and garden tools disappearing. The neighborhood felt chaotic for the first time in years. People who had once trusted each other now eyed strangers and even familiar neighbors suspiciously. The sense of safety that had defined the community was gone, all because of a few strokes of gray paint on a roof. Ethan spent the day running around, trying to calm everyone and assess the damage. He worked with the security company, explaining the situation and asking for temporary fixes, but there was only so much they could do. Mobile cameras and temporary alarms could only cover part of the neighborhood. He realized that until the solar panels were repaired, the entire system would remain weak. Meanwhile, Karen was acting as if nothing had happened. She continued attending HOA meetings, talking about community aesthetics and property value, ignoring the chaos her actions had caused. Some neighbors confronted her, but she waved them off with a dismissive smile, insisting she had done nothing wrong. Her calm, almost smug demeanor only made people angrier. Ethan decided he couldn't wait for the HOA to act. He began organizing neighborhood patrols. Volunteers took shifts walking the streets, checking doors and windows and keeping an eye out for suspicious activity. While helpful, it wasn't the same as the security system. Ethan could feel the tension building. People were scared, angry, and frustrated, and many were starting to blame him personally, not understanding that Karen was the cause. One afternoon, Ethan noticed a suspicious van parked near the edge of the neighborhood. He grabbed his binoculars and watched. A man was moving around, looking at houses, taking notes. Ethan called a few neighbors quietly and alerted them.
Ow.
They watched together, trying to figure out what the man was doing.
Ow.
It was clear he wasn't just passing by, he was studying the neighborhood. Ethan's heart raced. The security system, powered by his panels, would have detected him instantly. Oh, they were blind. He debated calling the police, but without clear evidence of a crime, they might not act immediately. He realized how vulnerable everyone had become. By evening, another problem arose. Kids playing outside noticed the absence of cameras and alarms. They began venturing further from their homes, climbing trees and riding bikes in ways they normally wouldn't because they assumed there was some level of surveillance. Parents panicked, shouting warnings, creating tension that spread like wildfire. The neighborhood had gone from calm to chaotic in less than a week. Ethan spent hours walking the streets, talking to people, and explaining the truth. He emphasized that the problem was Karen, not him. Slowly, some neighbors began to understand, though frustration lingered. Many still didn't grasp how essential the panels were. Some even doubted his explanations, thinking he might be exaggerating. Then things escalated further. One evening, Ethan heard breaking glass from a neighbor's house. He ran over and saw a masked figure trying to enter through a back window. Ethan yelled, and the figure ran off. Normally, the motion sensors would have triggered alarms and neighbors would have been alerted instantly, and police might have arrived quickly. But without the panels, everything had failed. Ethan realized the neighborhood had narrowly avoided serious danger. The following day, the HOA finally scheduled an emergency meeting. Residents packed into the community hall, angry and anxious. Ethan presented all the evidence: security footage of Karen painting over the panels, reports of thefts and attempted break-ins, and the explanation of how the panels powered the neighborhood system. Some neighbors gasped, others shook their heads in disbelief. It was finally clear how serious the situation was. Karen, of course, denied everything. She insisted she was correcting an aesthetic issue and that the security problems were unrelated. Ethan remained calm, showing the undeniable footage of her on the roof. Murmurs filled the room as people realized the truth. Karen had been caught. Her attempt to undermine the neighborhood's safety had been deliberate, not accidental. After hours of heated discussion, the HOA agreed on a plan. Karen would be held responsible for the damage. Repairs would begin immediately, funded in part by her, and the neighborhood security system would be restored. Ethan felt a small sense of relief, but he knew there was still work to do. The panels had been destroyed, the security system had failed, and trust in the community had been shaken. The days that followed, Ethan worked tirelessly. He coordinated with the solar company to replace the panels as quickly as possible, oversaw temporary security measures, and reassured neighbors that steps were being taken to restore safety. The stress was immense, and the emotional toll was heavy. He barely slept, constantly checking the system and keeping an eye out for trouble. Neighbors began to notice Ethan's dedication and started supporting him. Some helped with patrolling, others assisted with communication and updates. Slowly, a sense of teamwork began to form. People realized that Ethan had been protecting them all along, that the real threat had been Karen's obsession and destructive behavior. Even with progress, tension lingered. Karen continued to be confrontational, showing up at HOA meetings and trying to undermine decisions. But with clear evidence against her, her influence began to wane. Neighbors who had once been intimidated by her started speaking out, standing up for Ethan and the safety of the community. One afternoon, Ethan walked through the neighborhood and noticed something remarkable. Despite the chaos, people were beginning to cooperate. Neighbors who had barely spoken before were now sharing information, looking out for each other and understanding the importance of the panels. Ethan realized that, in a way, Karen's actions had unintentionally strengthened the community. Still, the immediate danger was far from over. The neighborhood had experienced thefts, attempted break-ins, and widespread anxiety. Until the panels were fully repaired, Ethan knew they were not completely safe. Every day, he checked the temporary system, coordinated with the solar company, and reassured residents. By the end of the week, the first replacement panels arrived. Technicians worked quickly, installing them carefully while Ethan supervised. Neighbors watched with relief as the rooftop slowly returned to its original state. Cameras were reconnected, alarms were restored, and the motion sensors came back online. A sense of calm gradually returned to the neighborhood. Ethan felt a deep sense of satisfaction as the system hummed to life. The neighborhood was safe again, at least for now. He knew Karen might still cause trouble, but the community had seen the consequences of her actions. People had learned the importance of the panels and of looking out for each other as he stood on his porch, watching the sunset. Ethan reflected on the week's events. Chaos had erupted, safety had been threatened, and fear had spread. But through determination, quick thinking, and cooperation, the neighborhood had survived. The panels were repaired, security restored, and trust slowly returning. Ethan knew there would be more challenges ahead, but for the first time in days, he felt hope. After the solar panels were repaired and the security system restored, the neighborhood felt a cautious sense of relief. The cameras worked again, the motion sensors were active, and the streetlights came on reliably every evening, for a few days. Ethan allowed himself to think that the worst was over. Neighbors smiled at him as they passed, thanked him for his tireless efforts, and seemed to trust the safety of their community once more. But Ethan knew better. Karen had not been deterred. She had a way of simmering quietly before striking. Again and Ethan could sense that her next move would be more dangerous. It started subtly at first. Packages went missing again, though only a few. Garden tools were misplaced. Minor incidents that at first seemed like coincidences, but Ethan noticed patterns. Each small incident occurred near houses where Karen had recently complained about the paint, landscaping, or clutter. It was almost as if she was sending messages, testing boundaries, seeing how far she could push the neighborhood without being caught. One evening, Ethan walked through the neighborhood after dinner, checking the cameras and reviewing security footage. He paused at a gate and noticed a familiar figure lurking in the shadows. Karen. She was dressed in black, moving stealthily from house to house. Ethan's stomach sank. He hadn't expected her to escalate this quickly. He backed away quietly and called a few neighbors who had volunteered for extra watch duties. Together, they observed her movements from a safe distance. Karen wasn't just wandering. She was inspecting doors, windows, and even the camera angles. It was obvious she was planning something bigger. The next day, the HOA received a letter. It wasn't polite. It was a formal complaint from Karen, accusing Ethan of harassment, spreading lies, and interfering with HOA regulations. She demanded that he stop overseeing the security system and threatened legal action.
Ouch!
Some neighbors read it and shook their heads in disbelief. They had seen the footage, the broken panels, the thefts, and the chaos she had caused. But the letter gave her a new weapon: paperwork. Karen knew that legal threats could intimidate people, and she was ready to use them. Ethan refused to be intimidated. He responded with facts, reports, and a detailed timeline of her actions. He showed the HOA board security footage of her painting over the panels, documented thefts during that period, and explained the direct connection between her actions and the neighborhood's vulnerability. Many board members nodded, but Karen was cunning. She had been part of the HOA for years, and some older members were hesitant to act against her. Fearing lawsuits or conflict, as tensions escalated, Karen's behavior became more aggressive. One night, she attempted to climb onto Ethan's roof while he was inside his house. She had a ladder and gloves, clearly intending to tamper with the solar panels again. Ethan caught her in the act when he looked out of his window and saw her shadow moving across the roof. He immediately called the police. When they arrived, Karen tried to claim she had permission from the HOA to inspect the panels, but the officers didn't believe her. She was cited for trespassing and warned that further attempts could lead to arrest. The neighborhood's sense of safety wavered again. Parents kept children inside after dark, neighbors walked in pairs, and everyone checked doors and windows multiple times a day. Ethan spent long hours coordinating with law enforcement, updating security protocols, and reassuring the residents. Despite the repairs, the psychological impact of Karen's actions lingered. People were scared of her next move, and that fear made them anxious and tense. Then came the most shocking event. One night, a fire broke out in a neighbor's garage. Smoke filled the street, and alarms sounded. Ethan grabbed a fire extinguisher and ran outside, but it was too late to prevent damage. The fire department arrived quickly, but the garage was severely damaged. Neighbors were in shock. Initially, they thought it was an accident. Ethan, however, had a sinking feeling. The fire's location and timing seemed deliberate, near houses Karen had frequently complained about. Over the next few days, Ethan investigated. Quietly, he reviewed security footage, questioned neighbors, and checked the timing of other minor incidents. Everything pointed to one conclusion: Karen was escalating. She had moved from petty sabotage to actions that could cause serious harm. Ethan realized that the painted-over panels were just the beginning. Karen's obsession with control and aesthetic perfection had turned dangerous. The entire neighborhood was at risk. The HOA finally convened an emergency meeting. Tension filled the room. Residents were angry, scared, and desperate for a solution. Ethan presented his findings, showing that Karen had been involved in multiple incidents, including the attempted roof tampering and the suspicious circumstances around the garage fire. Some neighbors gasped, realizing how close they had come to disaster. Others were angry that the HOA had not acted sooner to prevent escalation. Karen, as expected, denied everything. She claimed the fire was an accident and that she had done nothing wrong. She tried to shift blame onto Ethan, saying he had created hostility in the neighborhood. But Ethan remained calm, showing evidence and documenting every claim. The board finally voted to restrict her HOA privileges and to involve law enforcement for further investigation. Despite these actions, Karen was relentless. She began showing up at neighbors' houses unannounced, questioning their security systems, and making veiled threats. Some neighbors, scared and unsure of how to respond, called Ethan for advice. He realized he needed to take more drastic measures to protect the community. He coordinated with law enforcement, installed temporary locks on vulnerable access points, and created a neighborhood communication network to alert residents immediately of suspicious activity. Even with these measures, the psychological pressure on the community was intense. Parents were afraid to let children play outside. Deliveries were left on porches only after verification, and neighbors avoided confronting Karen directly for fear of retaliation. Ethan felt the weight of responsibility. He had not only repaired the panels and restored the security system, but now had to actively protect people from a human threat, someone cunning, dangerous, and relentless. One morning, Ethan noticed that a section of the new solar panels had been tampered with. Nothing major, but it was clear that someone had tried to loosen the bolts. He called the solar company immediately. Now, they came out and fixed it, but it was a stark reminder that Karen's obsession was ongoing. Every step forward felt fragile, like walking on thin ice. Ethan decided it was time for a more direct approach. He organized a neighborhood watch meeting, bringing together all residents willing to participate. They discussed schedules, communication strategies, and ways to document any suspicious activity. Ethan also worked with law enforcement to set up a formal reporting system, so any potential incidents could be recorded and addressed legally. The next few weeks were tense. Karen tested boundaries repeatedly, but Ethan and the neighborhood watch were ready. She would approach houses, try to engage neighbors in arguments, or make complaints to the HOA, but they recorded everything. Finally, law enforcement had enough documented evidence to take stronger action. Karen was warned that any further interference with the neighborhood security system or harassment of residents would result in criminal charges. Through all this, Ethan's role was crucial. He balanced protecting the community, coordinating with authorities, and keeping neighbors informed and calm. The stress was enormous, but he never wavered. Slowly, the neighborhood began to regain confidence. Children played outside again, packages were safely delivered, and the sense of safety began to return. Yet Ethan knew this was not the end. Karen's obsession had been exposed, but her vindictive nature could still pose a threat. The lesson was clear: vigilance and community cooperation were essential, not just technology. Ethan realized that safety relied on people working together, documenting issues, supporting one another against threats, both human and otherwise. By the end of this part, the neighborhood was recovering, but scars remained. Trust had been tested, fear had lingered, and the danger of escalation had been real. Ethan, however, emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined. He understood that protecting a community required more than fixing broken panels. It required awareness, courage, and the willingness to confront difficult people directly. As he looked across the street, watching neighbors interacting more openly again, Ethan knew that the real battle had been won, but vigilance would always be necessary. Karen had caused chaos, fear, and destruction. But she had also shown the neighborhood and himself the importance of resilience, leadership, and standing up to threats, no matter how persistent or intimidating they might be. This part 4 continues. The story with rising tension, Karen escalating her actions, neighborhood fear, Ethan's leadership, and the slow recovery while keeping it engaging and in simple English. The tension in the neighborhood had been building for months. Karen's antics had escalated from petty complaints to dangerous interference, and the residents were living in constant worry. Ethan had worked tirelessly to keep the community safe, but he knew that Karen would not stop until she was confronted directly and decisively. Part of him feared what she might do next, but he also understood that hesitation could cost them all dearly. It started with small warnings. Late at night, security cameras captured her lingering near houses, sometimes peering into windows or trying to access fences and gates. Every sighting sent a ripple of fear through the community. Ethan coordinated with the neighborhood watch to respond immediately to any suspicious activity, making sure everyone had phone numbers, a plan, and knew exactly how to react. The constant vigilance was exhausting, but it was necessary. One evening, as Ethan checked the security footage, he noticed something alarming. Karen had managed to slip past a few cameras and was attempting to tamper with the main solar panel array again. This was the heart of the neighborhood security system. If she succeeded, she could disable alarms, lights, and cameras across multiple houses. Ethan's pulse quickened. Quickly called law enforcement and activated the neighborhood emergency alert system. Residents received messages on their phones to stay indoors while authorities handled the situation. By the time the police arrived, Karen was caught in the act. She tried to claim she was inspecting the panels, but the evidence against her was overwhelming. Security footage clearly showed her opening the panel covers and attempting to disconnect wires. The officers detained her immediately, warning her that any future interference would result in serious criminal charges. For once, the neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief, but Ethan knew this was only part of the battle. Karen's obsession with control and perfection could manifest in unpredictable ways. He decided it was time to strengthen the security system beyond just repairing the solar panels. He brought in a professional security company to install advanced cameras, motion detectors, and automatic alerts for any tampering. He also coordinated with the HOA to establish strict rules for anyone attempting to access community infrastructure. With the new system in place, life began to return to normal, at least as normal as it could be after months of fear. Neighbors felt safer knowing that any suspicious activity would be immediately detected and reported. Packages could be left on porches without worry. Children played outside in the evenings, and families could finally relax at home. Ethan, however, remained vigilant. He knew that Karen's determination was not easily broken, and that continued oversight was essential. As the days passed, Karen's legal battles with the HOA also began to unfold. She filed lawsuits claiming harassment and defamation, trying to regain control and intimidate the residents. But this time, the HOA and Ethan were prepared. They had detailed documentation, including security footage, reports of incidents, and witness statements from neighbors. Every claim Karen made was countered with evidence. The legal proceedings moved slowly, but the balance of proof was clearly in favor of the community. Meanwhile, the neighborhood began to rebuild its sense of trust and unity. Residents formed groups to help each other, sharing tasks like package, pickup, evening walks, and security monitoring. Ethan encouraged everyone to stay alert but not fearful, to participate in community activities, and to support one another. Slowly, the shadow of Karen's intimidation lifted. Families began hosting small gatherings. Block parties were organized, and children played freely again. Ethan also focused on repairing the psychological damage caused by months of fear and tension. He spoke to neighbors individually, listening to their experiences and validating their concerns. He reminded them of the importance of staying calm, reporting suspicious behavior, and trusting the security measures in place. His leadership gave people confidence, and gradually, the community felt stronger than before. Then came the final confrontation. Karen, frustrated by legal setbacks and the inability to intimidate the neighborhood, decided to escalate her actions. One last time. Late one night, she tried to disable the newly upgraded security system by tampering with wiring in a utility box at the edge of the community. Unbeknownst to her, Ethan had implemented a monitoring system that sent real-time alerts to both him and the police. Within minutes, officers arrived, and Karen was caught red-handed. This time, there was no plausible explanation, no way to claim innocence. She was arrested and faced multiple charges, including trespassing, vandalism, and attempted tampering. With security systems, the arrest marked the turning point. The threat that had loomed over the neighborhood for months was finally neutralized. Residents felt a sense of closure, knowing that Karen could no longer endanger their homes or intimidate them with her obsessive behavior. The streets were calm. The cameras were functioning perfectly. The sense of fear that had once hung over the community had vanished. Ethan, though relieved, knew that vigilance was still important. He continued to monitor the system, ensuring that everything ran smoothly. He also continued to support the HOA in strengthening rules and policies to prevent similar situations in the future. The experience had taught him valuable lessons about leadership, community cooperation, and the importance of taking proactive measures to protect others. With time, the neighborhood fully recovered. Families returned to their routines, children played outside freely, and neighbors formed lasting friendships forged in the crucible of shared adversity. The story of Karen and her disruptive actions became a cautionary tale, reminding everyone of the importance of community, vigilance, and standing up against threats. No matter how persistent or intimidating, Ethan's efforts were recognized by the community. Neighbors thanked him repeatedly for his courage, diligence, and leadership. They knew that without his quick thinking and determination, the situation could have been far worse. But Ethan, ever humble, insisted that the true strength of the neighborhood lay in its unity. He reminded everyone that by supporting one another, documenting incidents, and staying alert, they had collectively turned a dangerous situation into a story of resilience and triumph. In the months that followed, the HOA made permanent changes to prevent any individual from exerting undue control over community systems. Strict rules were enforced regarding property access, security systems, and dispute resolution. Karen, now facing the consequences of her actions, was legally barred from the neighborhood and had to deal with the ramifications of her repeated attempts to harm the community. The story, though harrowing, ultimately became one of triumph. Neighborhood had been tested to its limits, but had emerged stronger, safer, and more connected than ever. Ethan continued to oversee security measures, mentor neighbors, and ensure that the lessons learned from Karen's obsession were never forgotten. He understood that safety was an ongoing responsibility, but he also knew that with vigilance, unity, and courage, any challenge could be overcome. As the sun set one evening, casting a warm glow across the repaired solar panels and quiet streets, Ethan stood outside and watched families interacting peacefully. Children laughed as they played, neighbors waved as they passed, and the neighborhood felt alive again. The dark chapter of Karen's interference had ended, replaced by a renewed sense of safety, trust, and community spirit. Ethan smiled, knowing that while the battle had been difficult, it had also proven the power of resilience, leadership, and standing firm in the face of threats. The neighborhood had not only survived, but had grown stronger. The solar panels gleamed in the fading sunlight, now symbols not just of energy, but of vigilance, unity, and the triumph of a community that refused to be intimidated by the end. Of this story, Karen was no longer a threat. The neighborhood's security was stronger than ever, and the residents had learned the importance of working together, documenting evidence and supporting one another through challenging times. Ethan's courage and dedication had been the catalyst for change, but it was the collective effort of the community that ultimately ensured safety, peace, and lasting harmony.